Good afternoon and welcome to the Computational Science Colloquium series. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Jarrod Brzenski, Dr. Jarrod Brzenski, who is going to talk about how to build a coastal ocean model using mimetic finite difference or mimetic differences already, but also not only that, using the library model that we have developed and allows you, basically the way I describe it, is a building block to construct computationally efficient codes to solve complex problems. And also he's gonna talk about a lot of his musings from his journey through here.
Thank you, Zay. So I'll get started. So I'll go over a quick background of why did I choose this for my PhD project, and like a sort of rationale. I'll go over some basics of the mimetics and how they're used to solve the Navier-Stokes equations and how I use them. Well, so I'll go over a little bit of grids, grid generation. How do you make grids that you do computations on? It turns out it's more awkward than you think. Some talks, right? And then I build this model. How do I parallelize it? Right, because I've made a model that scales to thousands of cores. How does that happen? And then some test cases, like how do you actually check your work to make sure that what you did is correct? And interspersed in there, I'll put some notes about like specifically what in CSRC was really helpful for me in terms of this specific project. So the rationale for this, right? There's tons, I made an ocean model, and there's tons of ocean models, but they're all very large, very complicated, and not user-friendly. In having used most of the ocean models that exist, is from like the biggest ones for climate modeling down to small regional ones, they're terrible for users. Like nobody should ever have to use them. They're so complicated. So I was like, okay, I want to make my own that's more user-friendly, but also has some other features. So the first one I integrated was the Mimetic Operators. Right, and those are just calculus operations. But what's cool is they do the calculus up to and including the boundaries. You'll take like a finite difference class. The boundaries are usually where bad stuff happens. But these handle the boundaries on their own, supposedly. So that was a selling point for me. They also work on curvilinear coordinates or grids that have been like twisted and misshapen. And in ocean modeling, that happens all the time. This is a canyon off Monterey, California. Like if you have to put a grid into all those crevices, that is a messed up grid. And doing math on that is terribly complicated. But if these operators work on those grids without any like extra work from me, even better. And computational efficiency. I want things to go fast. I like when code runs really, really fast. And while they're not finite difference method, they are implemented very much like a finite difference, which is one of the fastest ways of doing a calculus operation. 3 selling points. My one slide on mimetic operators, because I don't know, there's been other colloquiums on there. Right, they're just calculus operations, right? And so like the simplest one is the integration by parts. So there's multiple operators for the calculus operators. There's a divergence, a gradient, a Laplacian. The main point about these is they work on a staggered grid, not your normal grid. We'll jump into this 2D example, right? Usually, like when we have coordinates, right, they're all at all the corners, the nodes. Mimetics need an additional little bit of information where they need like this additional half step. So maybe we'll use this one for an example. Right, if we just have like a number line, usually you have a point, and then you have another point, and another point, and another point. That is just a regular grid. Mimetics need this additional like little half step. So I want to say, should we go into vectors? How much time do I have? All right. So an example. It makes sense when you think of like if you're tracking a quantity, vectors, right? If you have some little space and you have things going in and out of that space, you want a vector to track that, right? Because a vector is magnitude and direction. So vectors are going to live on the outsides because you just want to track what's like leaving and going into some space. So vectors, these, are going to live on the boundaries of these little spaces. If you have something scalar, like a concentration, a temperature, like a fixed value, like in the center, you're going to track it in the center. Yeah. So scalar values will be in the center of the cell. So if these are the boundaries, scalar will be this dot that's in the middle. So when you do an operation on those, right, if we do an operation on the velocities, which would be the divergence, right? The divergence of a vector is a scalar. So the answer is going to live where the scalars live in the middle. So if the v's are on the boundaries and you take the divergence of them, that answer, a scalar, has to live in the middle. So that's the dv here. The divergence of the vectors lives in the centers, and vice versa. If you have scalars and you take the gradient of those scalars, you get a vector. The vectors have to live on the boundaries. So if u's, which are my scalars, you take the gradient of those, they will live on the boundaries. So I guess that is the most complicated part of mimetic operators. You keeping track of where these things go. I mean, mathematically it makes sense, right? If you have the gradient of a scalar, you get a vector. But like keeping track of those locations is it. This library, though, that creates these is available on GitHub. It's the blue one. All right, there's ones for C++ and MATLAB, or Octave if you don't want to use MATLAB. These operators are built for multiple dimensions. So if you have this is 1D and a 2D example, but there's a 3D operator. Multiple orders of accuracy, second, fourth, and sixth. B++ only goes to fourth. And yeah, and it also works on curvilinear grids. My mimetic spiel. Okay, so how do I apply these solving the Navier-Stokes equation? So this is a simplified Navier-Stokes equation that we work with, right? You have gradients, you have divergences. We have a Navier-Stokes. Remember, U is a 3D vector, so it's X, Y, and Z directions. There's a density, that's a pressure, and then a diffusion term. For those of you who are super psyched on this, there are a bunch of other terms over here, a bunch of forcing terms, things like Coriolis, subgrid stress tensor, but for sanity and for brevity, I just left them off. They're there in the model. The divergence of the vector field is assumed to be 0, and then any scalar quantities, things like temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, will be advected with this bottom equation. So solving all these at once is what my model does. Non-hydrostatic Boussinesq approximation. So this is used for things that have small differences in density, like ocean water. I chose this, right, because I wanted to make an ocean model. This works on a lot of different scenarios that happen in the ocean. And it's also adaptable to a bunch of different grids. Okay, so I just took the momentum equation as the top one here. To apply mimetics to this, right, I can just directly replace the divergence operator with the mimetic version of the divergence. Call it D. Same for the gradient of the pressure, I'm just gonna do mimetic gradient times pressure. And then the Laplacian of U is Laplacian U. Like I put an F here, just, oh, it's supposed to be covered. That's literally it. It's a direct replacement. And if I want to do it in curvilinear coordinates, right? If I have some sort of messed up physical grid, usually what we would have to do is you take this, you convert your math of some sort of Jacobian to logical space, right? A uniform grid spacing, do math there, and then convert it all back to your physical grid to see what's actually happening. The mole library has that transform built in, and it has it built into the operators. So if it's on a curvilinear grid, it's essentially there's this Jacobian that just comes down with each of the operators, and it's a constant, so you can drag it in and pre-multiply those together, the Jacobian divergence, Jacobian gradient, and you have some operators. And that's it.
Yeah, so, if you're gonna do a numerical solution, you have to discretize time too. Is there something about time that, fits into the mimetic framework
No, time is on your own. The mimetic is just for space.
so far?
Okay, so for those of you who want to know, like how do you solve that giant equation? You can't solve it all at once. You got to do it in like little steps, break it down, and use the pieces as you move along. So first step is estimate the advection. So U star. Guess what the advection is in that giant equation. So we solve that first one to get a U star. And, right, so that solution you get is you assume is a combination of the divergence free vector field and the gradient of the pressure. And we know that the divergence of the true solution is supposed to be 0. So if we take the derivative of this whole equation, we get this one, right? Divergence U star, divergence of this is 0, which is why it disappeared, and then you have divergence gradient, which is Laplace. And then you solve this for pressure. So rearrange it and you get something that looks like this. This is actually the most expensive step in the whole computation, right? Because this is, if you think of this as like an AX equals B, a matrix, right? This is just a matrix times X equals this. Solve that. That gives us our divergence free vector. I'm sorry, gives us a pressure. We can update to get the divergence from that other equation. And then once we know our true velocity, then advect all the other things like salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, etc. And we iterate, go over them many, many times. So how do you validate this? So this was a few years ago. This was all first done in MATLAB, my original code. The first one, my favorite one, is the lock release, where you have these two different, you have a fluid with two different densities, cold and hot. It's not even cold and hot, it's like warm and slightly warmer. And as they move past each other, it creates a shear layer where there's friction, and as they pass each other, they kind of roll. And numerically, right, the speed of this front here can be estimated pretty analytically. Based on the friction at the bottom, the density of the fluids. But this is, wait.
But how do you start the experiment?
So it's assumed you start at rest. You just have a line down the middle, warm fluid, cold fluid, and then you let it go. And the cold fluid will naturally want to slide under the warm fluid. Yes? So this is, after 21 seconds, this is my simulation. This is one from a different numerical simulator. Levesque's ocean model. It's not ClawPack, it might be Claw. Anyway, but it's supposed to be super uniform. The wavefront should propagate the same speed. So it meshed, right? And this is all with the mimetic operators. Then we can do other standard tests like lid-driven cavity, where you blow across the top at, it's a unit square, you blow across the top 1 meter per second, and then you go let it go to a steady state, and then you draw a line down the middle and look at the u velocities, that's the sideways, and then you look at the v velocities, which is up and down. And this has been studied ad nauseum. So you have these red dots, which is results from literature from like 1990, where they had like results like 4 decimal places, and then you can see mine gets pretty close to it as well. Flow in a pipe, right? Things that it has an analytic solution. We can simulate, and this one was cool because this was the first one I gave it a curvilinear grid. So the grid, this is a simplified version of the grid this is running on, right? So none of the cells are the same. They're all curvilinear, both x and y. You give like an inlet velocity, an inlet profile. So it's fastest in the middle, and then it's 0 on boundaries, and then you check what it is at the end. Should be the same. So here's the velocity profiles. They're all overlapping each other. The difference is like 10 to the -4 or something. We'll see it later. Then we can do it in a pipe too. So same thing, right? This is all the same code, all the same, like this one is the same inlet and outlet conditions. It's just the grid is changing. I'm just giving it a different grid, but I'm not changing any of the code, which I guess is like the versatility of it, right? It works for whatever grid you want to get it. So flow to pipe, and then the last one was flow over seamount. So again, you have some sort of inlet velocity, you give a specific profile, and then you get a wake behind the seamount. Right, so this proved that it works. It works in 2D, so then let's make this in 3D and make it a program in C++ that makes it run faster. The thing that this really requires, though, is careful consideration of those grids. I did not know this, and in my PhD, I spent a good time making grids, learning how to make grids smooth. I think in my dissertation it was like 20 pages. So the mimetic operators, the one requirement of the grid, it can be curvilinear and messed up, but it's got to also be smooth. So I talk about smoothness in terms of a grid. I'm talking like you pick some cell, as you move to the cell next to it, it's like a minimal change in dx and dy. Right, so the difference between any 2 adjacent cells is very small. I can travel from, a weird 45-degree cell to this cell, but as I do it, the change between each cell is very small. So that's what I mean with smooth. The difference between any adjoining cells is minimal. So the point is to make a grid, ensure it's smooth before you do any operations. And there's a couple ways of doing that. So this was an example. This is a grid over an airfoil. Imagine like a long skinny grid, and then I just kind of wrap it around. So like the bottom of this grid is this line all the way around the outside. I just strapped it around. So if this would have been the left-hand side, and this would be the right-hand side. But anyway, that's the initial grid, and then I can smooth it, and it turns into this grid. So it looks super similar, but it's a much smoother transition between cells. It's like the discontinuity that was right about here is gone. Yeah.
So when you define your grid, I mean, ultimately you're going to have to solve the matrix equation, and your coefficients have to be changing with the definition of the grid, right?
Explain.
A curvilinear grid, you compute the flux across boundaries, it's going to depend on the direction of the boundary, the size of the boundary. So doesn't that show up in the matrices? And how is that information get from the grid definition into the setup of the problem?
So when you transform the coefficients in Mole, you start with the original grid, and whatever this is, the initial or smooth grid, or if it's an octopus or something like that, it's being computed on a regular grid, and then that if you started with if you did something like a smooth grid, I mean, if your octopus is over there and you have a smooth octopus over here, you've done the calculations. Each grid point has a number associated with it, and then all you have to do is invert the smoothness operator, and you get the original octopus or whatever. Well, I'm assuming it transforms all the way back.
Yes, with other requirements. And then for yours, there are, right, so I guess the advantage is, one, the grid never changes. Two, yes, if we're doing some sort of like this one with flow over an airfoil, that inflow would need to be calculated for this grid itself, like a priori, to actually doing any of the work. That's not taken care of, like converting inlet and outlet conditions.
That's boundary conditions though, right?
Yeah, so like the actual conversion does not happen with mole. That's still on you to calculate that.
I mean, my question is related to his, but there has to be a transform relating your coordinate, your curvilinear coordinates to the standard Cartesian. And somewhere that has to get expressed in this process, right? Does that make sense? I mean, you have grid elements there that aren't rectangles, and they don't necessarily have right angle edges, right?
Right.
So I mean, the law is the flux has to be expressed in terms of the area or the length of a boundary, and that varies from one side to another of a curvilinear grid element. Right?
So
there's something missing here. I can't get my head around.
So I guess that transform, that I don't know what even you want to call it, like I'll call it Jacobian, even though we've had arguments over the nomenclature, is taken care of in the operator, in the actual calculus, let's say the divergence operator. It's, if you want to think of it as a separate, there is a transform. Oh, start. Take a value. Take any value on this grid. There's a Jacobian times it, which will transform it, then the gradient, and then the Jacobian that will transfer. So there's like a J and a J inverse that will get multiplied. But you have your value, you have a J, a gradient, and the J inverse. These are all just matrices you can.
But the J's are based on the coordinate system.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And those are all just.
I think I just understand.
Those are all just mushed together into one operator. We'll call it like a curvilinear gradient. Because, and right, that's
answered the question.
Okay.
Also, one final comment. If you use cylindrical coordinate or spherical coordinate, which are only like, I don't know, 5 explicit coordinate system that you can write down, but then you do curvilinear coordinate, you get the same answer.
Okay.
But
Because, I mean, I know these operators look different if you transform them a priori to a different coordinates. So you're just saying if you apply the Jacobian to a priori defined grid, that you're going to end up with the same answers if you do the transformation of the equation beforehand. Okay. Yes.
Sorry to draw this up. You mentioned cylindrical and spherical, and those are closed. I mean, so let's say it's a cylinder that connects. How do you deal with the wraparound?
then you would put the two ends that touch would be periodic with each other. Right, like if you let like this be the outlet and this be the inlet and you connect them, then you have just treat it like a periodic boundary, even though it's however you want to define it, it's a rectangle.
So if you have a grid that's extraordinarily weird or something like that, and you go to the solid geometry, people that do the Booleans and things, they combine things. and get the really weird octopi and stuff like that. You could probably segment these things into what the constructive solid geometry people think are separate, Boolean components, and then process them separately, and then you wind up with the entire answer.
Yeah, so
To
it's
try
like a
that.
technique, like whatever your grid is, if it can be assigned a one-to-one correspondence, let's say in 2D, whatever it is, if it can be assigned one-to-one to a rectangle, it'll work. You can break it, and there's basically a requirement that the Jacobian, the transform, has to have all the same sign, whatever it is. They're all positive, all negative, and if it does that, it's a valid grid. So there's other things you can go over, right? The smoothing can be done either through like a smooth function, like it can be defined with a smooth function, or you can put the grid, give it to an elliptical solver and use the X and Y coordinates as the values, and the elliptical solver will solve it. And then it's up to you to decide things like the boundaries. Do you need orthogonal boundary cells? Because you have some sort of inlet. You don't want it to like instantly start ticking up weird. So you can make the boundaries orthogonal to give, to help your boundary if you need that. Or maybe you don't, and you can leave it, you can smooth all the way to the edges. So what I end up doing is, right, to make these grids, you can just define a boundary. That's all you need. The user defines a boundary. You transfinite interpolate, so just draw lines between, top, bottom, left, and right. This is 2D. You do the same in 3D. Right, and you use this as an initial guess to the elliptical solver, which then takes your answer and smooths it out. So it's here, like the middle is awkward and turns into a nice grid. You can even do complex grids. Again, you don't need that middle step, because technically you can use just the boundaries and give it to an elliptical solver and it'll generate these, but it just takes longer. So I'm implementing this in parallel. So I took all that, I put it in a C++ program, and right, these are usually doing, these are going to model large regions of the ocean, millions of cells, like 10 million is an average, 10 million points. So it needed to be parallelized. So I use domain decomposition, right, where you take your grid and you just cut it into pieces, and each node will process the grid on its own, which is super handy with mimetic operators. It lets me parallelize most of the code. Like 95% of the code is parallelized. So it runs really fast, it's really efficient. The only downside, right, is that grid, again, the staggered grid is awkward and it needs more care when you split it. So like, this is an example of that. Let's say we have a grid, for the next slide. Simple grid, right? There's the staggered grid. The red dots are scalar values, the triangles are vectors. So I have some grid with values at all those points, and I just want to split it in half. I want one process to do the left side, one process to do the right side. So I want to split it down the middle. Right, when you split a domain, each one has to know a little bit about what's happening next to it. So there's a little bit of an overlap. So the process 0, right, is going to take the cell next to it. Process 1 is going to take one the other direction. And this works really well, except for the scalar value of the staggered grid. Right, the staggered grid, the red dots here, right? There's a boundary, and then the middle of the cell, middle of the cell, middle cell, middle cell, middle cell, middle boundary. When I cut, and I take, let's say I'm on process 0, I cut and I take one over, this is my boundary. There is no red dot there. There is no scalar value on my boundary. Anywhere here, there's, right, if this is the boundary, I'm supposed to have one on the corner, here, here. So those are all missing. So there's an extra step when you parallelize a domain with mimetics. You have to calculate these missing values. And right, this is a nice Cartesian grid, but this could be some kind of messed up curvilinear twisty grid. So that was slightly more work for that. Use a spline to get the value between the two. We made it to aside number 1. So this is where I call on someone from the audience to read this, but that's okay. I'll read it.
Where did you
Tell
learn
us.
the most of your HPC computing skills?
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, so the main area that I learned most of all of my like HPC skills was through the Sustainable Horizons Institute. SHR, you get an email from them probably once a month through CSRC. And I specifically went through the Sustainable Research Pathways. Dr. Marianne Loon is the head of it. And I got to go to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab 3 times, 3 summers for 30 weeks total. And it was all facilitated by them. I got paid to go. I went with Professor Paolini, who's in electrical engineering. And when I went there, the main guy I worked with was Dave Trebetic, who's a numerical algorithms guy. But it was pretty cool. I mean, 30 weeks was a long time to spend doing high performance stuff. So I worked on Chombo Crunch, which is an convection diffusion chemical reaction solver with adaptive mesh refinement. Sounds cool, right? I don't know what half that stuff means. This is an example of what it does. This is a calcite grain, so small, tiny subpore chemical, and fluid flow over it, and you can measure the chemical reaction. So it's things like carbon sequestration, like where they inject water into ground and it percolates through. That's what this model. And I have no background in chemistry at all. I barely know what an element is. But I get to work on this because deep down inside, right, it's all just math. I solved these, it was 3 coupled differential equations, which made sense to me. So I did a lot of work with GPU stuff. The first 2 years I was there, I was porting the chemistry solver to GPUs because they were part of the exascale computing project and they all wanted to use accelerators, and all this code that they had, that Paolini and Trebetic had, was in Fortran and C. And they were like, well, we want to run this on GPUs. So that was my job, was to take the chemistry solver and port it to GPUs. So I learned crazy amount about CUDA, profiling. I did some super intense stuff with CUDA, especially dynamic parallelism. That's like where you can call a CUDA kernel. That's like the thing on the GPU. And you can make that thing call more kernels. So it's like a spawning parallelization process, which is a trip because I don't know if it can, but like CUDA can't track that anymore.
How do you, what do you think of the CUDA NVIDIA Fortran CUDA libraries? Because they have.
Yeah, I enjoy all of them.
Just,
it was super cool too, because at Lawrence Berkeley, they had like a in-house NVIDIA person that I could just go down the hallway and ask questions of, and it was super cool. The 3rd year I was there, we did that. Basically, we were modeling. We were able to use machine learning to predict a reaction rate. So we had this like test case where there was a cylinder with spheres of calcite, or basically sand, and then as you push through it, can you measure the reaction rate? So to do machine learning, right, we needed a bunch of test cases. We needed a bunch of results that we can feed into an algorithm. So I did 8,000 basically grids, things like that. These are 2 different spacings, right? Randomly spaced, but with a consistent distance between the grains. Generate 8,000 of them, run 8,000 simulations on them, and then process the data from those 8,000 simulations. So right, it's fine to run one, but to like pragmatically just run all these at once was super cool. Like, Jared, can you come up with a better hacking algorithm for spheres? It was like a fundamental math question, guys. I appreciate you think I can do it. I couldn't. It's done. There's a guy, Tigwaki, with basically like a crane game, was the most efficient algorithm. Like if you stand this up and just drop spheres randomly, and then see if it works. See if the spacing is correct. But it was intense. My favorite part though about this was that I get to use some of the best supercomputers that existed. So like the first years I was there, I used this one called Perlmutter, which is at Lawrence Berkeley, and Sierra. No, sorry, I used Summit, which were at the time pretty good supercomputers. This is like your professor giving you a Formula One car and being like, you should get to school faster. Here's a Formula One car to drive. So super neat. And then the third year, I had been using Crusher and Spock, which were single nodes, but they put me on Frontier, which still is the #1 supercomputer. It was like day 2. They showed up like, Chris, you're gonna run this on Perlmutter, and Jared, can you get this up and running on Frontier? You're just gonna let me use this? This was before it was open to the public too, because Dave was his code is part of like the testing code that they run on the supercomputers to make sure that they scale to 8 million processes. So yeah, it was before anybody else used it. It was super cool. Super cool. I suggest you try it if you haven't.
You know, what's its top rank? Oh, 2023. Is it still one in 2024?
Yes.
There was no, it seems to me that you learn high performance computing on the lab, but you didn't learn anything at school.
I said the most. And yes, I took a class here, right? But there was just one, 605, which gives you the basics. But this was the extension. All right. So I tested it here at San Diego State on our own Mantis cluster, which is 6 compute nodes. It has this is run by Paolini, so it's got 1,200 cores, but it's got these crazy processors, which have a giant L3 cache. For those of you who aren't familiar, right? A chip. So these are paired chip servers. There's 2 chips right next to each other. And they have shared memory. There's an L1, L2, and L3, which is like super local memory, the chip, like on the chip that you can access super fast. And then there's like the regular memory, RAM, that the heap and the stack are on. But this insane large amount of shared memory, if you can write a program that fits in this, then your program theory never leaves the chip. And you don't have any sort of memory bandwidth issue. It's super fast. So this is my test case with 31 million cells, which is a good size.
How long did it take? How long?
I don't know. I just set the speed up. Right, because I ran what two write-outs.
I think I asked you that question at least 7 times.
Okay, I ran for 5 time steps and it wrote out twice. So there's I/O that happens, right? Because that's a write to disk, and it does 5 DTs. So number of processors is on the bottom. Red is perfect scaling. So if you use twice as many processors, right, it should go twice as fast. So that is the red line, and the black line is my speed up. So after some number of processors, I actually get better than super linear speed up. Maybe it's because of that giant L3 cache, which as I use more processors, right, my code is actually smaller and can fit in the L3.
Well, where did the perfect scaling come from? The literature, or because you're talking about a really groovy computer, and the literature may be talking about less than groovy computer.
Is it theoretical?
So it's the theoretically perfect, where if you use twice as many processors, it should go twice as fast, right? And that's all the red line is that's 1-to-1. But there's another thing. There's a super computationally expensive part, which involved solving a super sparse system, which uses something called super LU, which is this blue line here, which is really the time killer, and you see how that speeds up as well. Sorry. I also tested on a different compute cluster, Delta, this is University of Illinois. I used 7,000 hours here. of compute time. Very similar process. It doesn't have as big of an L3 cache. It's a slightly, it's a Gen 3 AMD processor, but same deal. 5 time steps, 2 IOs. This one I could max out at 1666 cores. 1666 because that was like the number that could divide my domain almost perfectly even. You know, just like a plus minus 1 on the domain size. And I had to start at 20 just because the computational cost of that, like the problem doesn't fit in memory with less than 20. Like this first one, I think cost me like 1,200 compute hours to do my 5 time steps because I had to take the whole node, all the nodes, 20 nodes I had to take because I used up all the memory. Same graph, perfect speed up. My code is slightly above it up until the end right there where the black line hits the red line. This is due to MPI communication overhead. But again, the sparse solver solving my pressure, it really likes small problems or it really doesn't like big problems. A lot of the speed up comes from that. Oh, side number 2. So
How
we're
did you get 200,000 hours of compute time?
sorry, this one, thank you, Ash. So, right, on Delta, I got an allocation of 200,000 compute hours for free. And through that, I got it through the Access program. So there's a website called access-ci.org, and it provides compute hours. Actually, it just provides credits for everybody, researchers, grad students, postdocs, everybody in this room. And the super cool thing is everybody in this room counts as a PI. So you don't need like your supervisor's permission. You can just ask for it, which is what I did. Now I asked with Chris Paolini, who is my co-PI, but they approved me before they approved him as my co-PI. So it was a moot point.
It used to be that you have to have a letter from your advisor or whatever, and they changed it, so now.
They did, yeah. So like
Making it easy.
what's cool is they approved me in like 2 hours. Like it's instantaneous. So you get credits. You see, this is a screenshot of my credit screen, and then you use it. You can buy compute hours on different systems. So I printed out these are all different clusters. HPC clusters that you could buy from. I mean, there's a very long list. It's just 2 screenshots. But it also shows you like, they give you credits and you can convert those to hours on a supercomputer. So like the Indiana Jetstream CPU, I can spend 1,000 credits and get 1,000 compute hours on their system. I can spend 1,000 credits and get 19 hours on San Diego Supercomputer's Expanse GPU cluster. There's like a discrepancy because if you pay for a GPU cluster, you have to pay for the whole node. Right? There's like 128 cores, and then you get 4 GPUs with that. So it seems like it's not worth it, but you're getting the whole node and 4 like A100 or H100 GPUs with it. So it works out. And you can buy storage. Why is this storage so expensive? Anyway, storage is cheap. You saw mine, I like paid for terabytes, I haven't used it. But anyway, access.ci.org is a great resource to get compute hours pretty much anywhere. All right, so my code has been parallelized, run some test cases. Now this is the 3D C++, curvilinear, all in one thing, right? This is just one code that is running different simulations. All I'm giving it is a different grid, different boundary conditions, different parameters like density, salinity, stuff like that. But the code is the code that generates all these is exactly the same as each other. So again, lid-driven cavity, more specific. This is 200 Reynolds number, 400 Reynolds number. Again, right, it's just supposed to hit all the dots, and it does a good job. Again, the flow through a pipe, again, different case. It looks like the same picture, but it's not, I promise. Some of you who are fluid people want to see the velocity down the axis, right? So the velocity of the fluid going down the middle over this messed up curvilinear grid. It's supposed to be 0.2, and this red line is the deviation. Right, this is 0.2025, so it's not much. The error plot here is 10 to the -4. So it does good on the pipe still. It still does good on the lock release, which looks the same, but it's not, I promise. And for an example, the MATLAB code from the very beginning took 57 minutes to run this simulation. When the C++ code took 65 seconds. All right, crazy speed up because I could parallelize it, and C++ is just faster than MATLAB anyway. And that was run on 100 cores. Right, we could also track the velocity of these fronts that propagate. Analytically, it's the Froude number based on the density between the two fluids. So then the blue line is the wavefront speed, and this is the theoretical limit. 1/√2 is what it's supposed to be. And it's pretty good, off by 5%. And just a cool picture of the sheet graphs, because when do you get to do plots of like this where they have different densities and do sheets? This is the only place I can put that in.
You wind up getting accepted in peer-reviewed journal. That's why you have that.
Right, you gotta be able to make really cool.
Yeah, how long do you think it would take to do the pipe in 2D for Nord Stream 2?
What's the Nord Stream?
You know, it's the oil pipeline from
Russia to
Russia
Germany.
Oh, can I just do like a meter of it and then?
No, it's like 2,000 miles or something. I know, I was just teasing it.
Yeah. And then so again, we gotta confirm that this model is like, it behaves the way it's supposed to, so when we do ocean stuff, it's correct. So we're just coming up with other test cases to prove that this thing is correct. So the third one that really ties in the pressure, I haven't really tied in pressure at all, but tying in pressure and the advection and the numerical, if there's some sort of numerical diffusion unwanted, is the SACE experiment. So I have some like tall column of water, and right, I have dense fluid. Yeah, colors backwards. Dense, non-dense, and I gave it this little hitch. And what happens, right? If this is the starting condition, if I let it go, right, this wall will just kind of slosh back and forth, right? It's like dense water. It'll just the dense stuff will slosh underneath the lighter stuff. And all I'm doing is I'm taking this domain and stretching it. So it's still this difference, but this one is just much taller, much taller, much taller. Crazy, and that's what that epsilon is. It's the ratio of the length to width. Or width to length. So if we zoom in on this interface right here, it'll still look like this. It's just scaled off. And so what we can do is we can track that, like let it go, run, and I want to know that wave speed that's propagating, that thing that's bouncing back and forth. So we can check that too. There we go, wave speed. So we can pick a point, like right here, and measure the up and down velocity, right? Because as stuff sloshes, right, it's got to go up and down along the wall. So that could be my W velocity, this dotted blue line. And then I can also check the side-to-side motion. So I can pick a point in the middle, and as this sloshes, right, it's got to kind of go in a circular motion. So there's a point here where you can just measure left and right. And then find the minimum and maximum, and just say that's okay. Those are the waves. It's the wave speed. We track the period. It never shows up. All right, so we check the velocity profile to show that it's actually non-hydrostatic. This is a plot of the analytic versus, you can't see the analytic though. Anyway, if this was hydrostatic, if it didn't care about pressure, these lines would be almost straight down, where you just have the whole bottom moving together. There's no like gradient. Same for the up and down motion. If this was non-hydrostatic, it'd be a straight line. The best one though is that last graph. So the wave speed for shallow water is you can actually calculate it. It's like 1 root g times the depth over, no, it's root gd. But as that column gets deeper and deeper, right, it turns into a deep water, and the deep water wave speed is also very much known. G lambda over 2 pi. So as we look at those previous those test cases, oops, right? This should behave like a shallow water. The wave propagating here should go at a shallow water speed. And as I move on, the wave should propagate at a deep water speed. And right, the model should track that, and it does. So look at the red dots here, the wave speeds for each one of those domains. The red line is the shallow water wave speed. The dotted line is the deep water wave speed limit. And we see here, it follows the shallow water and then it transitions to deep water, just like it's supposed to do. This is the happiest graph I have on here. This is one of those where like you can't, like it just has to work. There's no way to like manipulate it or like change some numbers. It just has to make that graph. I was so happy when that graph came out like that. So happy. It was also the last graph I had to make, but that's not the point. So then we can apply this to Monterey Bay. The right crazy canyon off the coast of Monterey. Monterey is here, and there's a super deep canyon, very close to shore. A lot of the tide sloshes up in there, and it will do overmixing, turning. That's why you got so much crazy animal and plant life there. Is probably due to this mixing of super cold, dense, nutrient-rich water mixing up to the surface. The grid for this is also terribly complicated. So there's the 3D. The teal cut is over here. The black and white cut is up here, and the difference between, right, like this cell here might be 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, and the ones on the end are meters by 18 meters. Yeah. So from 2.5 kilometers to 18 meters.
Yeah, if you just do the calculation, that's teal color. Is the grid the one that's orthogonal to the green? Where's the grid? That's the grid, right?
So this is just a slice. This white slice here, if you were to take it and lay it flat,
Yeah.
and actually it's not even laid flat because there's a fold right here where, right, because this comes in, then it cuts back, which is this weird like dark line, and then the green. No, the green goes right. But you get the scale, like as you get here, you can't see it anymore because it's these little cells way up here in the corner matched to these right here.
Would it be simpler to actually do slices at different distances and then combine them into a 3D picture, whatever?
Possibly. I mean,
Or would it be easier to actually do a 3D grid, do the transformations, and then solve it?
so that's, I mean, you bring up a good point. So like this grid right here, this is the actual bathymetry. This is not a smooth, especially over here where there's like a sharp peak and then trough. It is not smooth at all, especially like right here, this deep trough. Those two cells that are next to each other are terrible to do calculations on. So I've spent forever on this thing. So like this line right here, which is in the middle of a trough, it's super helpful if that can just be shifted off to the side a little bit.
Yeah, but wouldn't you just break it into 3 or 5? If there's 5 troughs with very nasty transitions, tangents or whatever. If you did 5 of them, then you could, combine them and stuff like that.
Yes.
It's the answer, it's not the grid that's being transformed, because you've solved that by breaking it up. But if you have the answer, all you have to do is display the answer.
You get if you break it in 5 pieces,
Yeah.
you can generate a mesh.
Sure.
That will be, nobody will know that you use for 5 pieces. At the end,
Okay.
you have one mesh, but it's easier to make than the way it's doing.
Okay.
Okay, my
But I'm just saying it's the tangents and stuff that won't affect it. Okay.
So so this is a slice. You see, this is like a much simpler grid. I had to cut out a lot of the spikes. Right, it's still ongoing stuff. Is to add all the super detail. So simulate a semi-diurnal tide, so tide pushes in and out twice a day. And as that happens, this cold water is pushed up and then back, and then when it's pushed again, you get some overturning. So you see the warm waters come down, cold waters come up, and then the little nook, you get these this overturning, and you get multi-directional flow inside these little canyons. Matching that to actual like measurements, they do measurements in the Monterey, and this is this is what they get, and matching this to this is stuff that like an oceanographer, any oceanographer help. Does this match? Does it not match? Oh, that's it. So you see a lot of I put every publication on here because I had assigns. So anything you see in yellow, I got through the Sustainable Horizons partnerships, either with Paolini or with Trevithick or both. The orange one is just a different random collaboration that I had with another person in the CSRC, David Rower. Yeah. But yeah, so a lot of the CSRC stuff I learned through the outside interactions with this group, not necessarily through the classes I had in here. Not saying the classes were bad, the classes were cool, but there's more out there too.
But yeah, but the CSRC is connected with a lot of good things outside.
I benefited, yes. Yeah, Mark.
Sure, so, those oceanographers are making measurements in some places they think are interesting. In your, modeling, could you, say, oh, this model is predicting something interesting, you should take a measurement there?
Yes. Could. And that would be, that's like the next step after I show that this matches, right? Because go back to this. Right there's like tons of data, but it's like they have data right there and right there and right there. And usually it's like I don't know, 1D or 2D, I guess, if you count that, because they put like these little the sensors that follow a line down and measure the water column. But like, how do I know what 3D stuff is interacting to make those measurements? So yeah, that's next steps. That was my other advisor, UC Irvine. She was an oceanographer, so that's the stuff that I would bounce off her. Kristen Davis.
But also we have now reconnected with a collaborator who does collect data, but high resolution data. So we're gonna try an experiment in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, no, I just had a general question. How do you like port a program you're running on your computer to like cluster? Like, what is that process?
So generally on your computer, you have something that you have compiled, right? It is not just an executable, but you have like the code that you compile to make the executable.
Yeah.
And so you would take that code and just copy it to the cluster. And on the cluster will have its own compiler, it'll have its own libraries. So if you have to do any modifications for those specific libraries, you do that, but then it's the same, you just compile it on the cluster, and it will become, if you compile it on the cluster, it will run on the cluster because it is compiled with the libraries and the compiler that are available.
But like, is it always like smooth? Like, it's just because it works, like, I'm thinking about like doing it, but like, I'm afraid that like when I bring it on another computer, it's just gonna give me like same folder or something, you know, because it's it maybe my computer just handles the memory better or something, maybe there's something I'm not seeing, and then I port to another computer, it'll just be like, oh, it doesn't, like, look the same.
So I mean, that is a thing, where I personally, like on my computer, I will have a minimal amount of things and I will load them specifically for myself, knowing that the cluster I'm gonna run on matches what I'm doing on my computer. For instance, like you compile something with BLOS or like Open BLOS. I make sure that my computer has one that is similar to the cluster. I don't compile things with like the newest compiler because the cluster is always a little bit behind. Because cluster always takes the most stable, well-tested code, and usually that's like 1 or 2 versions behind what is most currently available. That makes sense. Like if you do stuff in Python, like 3.10 or 3.12,
No, I mean, like.
nothing beyond that.
Like what kind of, like, you're using C++, so what kind of like, is it like +20 or is it like?
Oh no, gosh, no. Barely 13,
Really?
maybe 17. No 20.
Maybe 7?
You mean you can use it, but like on most clusters, it's the 13 and 17 are standard. But I mean, you can compile it with CCC 17, and if it works, it works.
Oh,
Right.
but like, so you're saying, if I have code that's only supported through 17 and beyond, I can't run it on the cluster?
You can. You will just have to install your own GCC.
Oh, on the cluster?
Yes, you can install your own stuff.
Oh, okay.
You can't. I don't know if you Linux. You can't sudo apt it, but you can download GCC, compile GCC, and like link it to your path, so it uses the CCC or the GCC that you put on there. I had to do that on one of the clusters here. I needed like GCC 20, and he didn't have it, and it wasn't going to be on there, so I manually did it. But it's doable.
Okay.
How long did that take? An
8
hour,
hours.
2 hours?
Oh, the compile took
No, I don't mean that. I mean, for you to install it.
8 hours, maybe,
Okay.
because there were a lot of dependencies that you
So
don't.
now you know how long it's gonna take you.
Yeah, that's not bad. Maybe one or something.
Any
You should
other
have
question?
tried.
Any other question?
I'll give you my Mac and you can install.
Okay, so
all that stuff.
Thanks for the call. If you go with the tradition, we're gonna take our speaker to Eureka.